Rudolf Höss, the former commandant of Auschwitz concentration camp, is hanged on a gallows built specifically for him, erected just meters from the villa where he'd lived with his wife and 5 children while overseeing the murder of over 1.1 million people. His last words, spoken to the Polish prosecutor, "I have no words of hatred. The judgment of history has already been pronounced." But history's judgment on Rudolf Höss was just beginning, and it would echo through his family for generations. When Höss died, he left behind a wife, Hedwig, who had lived in domestic bliss at Auschwitz while the chimneys smoked. He left behind 5 children who had played in a garden just beyond the camp's wall, tended by prisoners who would be murdered the next day. He left behind a legacy so toxic that his descendants would spend the rest of their lives trying to escape it, or, in some cases, defending it. This is the story of what happened to the Höss family after the commandant of Auschwitz was executed. It's not the story you think you know, because one of his sons would spend decades defending his father and died believing Auschwitz was exaggerated Allied propaganda. His daughter would publicly apologize to Holocaust survivors 60 years after the war ended. And his wife would spend 45 years after his execution living comfortably in Germany, never once expressing remorse for the years she spent living in luxury while human beings were reduced to ash next door. The Hitler's family's story reveals brutal truths about inherited guilt, the psychology of denial, and whether redemption is even possible when your childhood home overlooked the gates of hell, the house next to hell. To understand what the family became, you need to understand what they were and where they lived. Rudolf Höss wasn't a sadistic monster who looked the part. He was a career SS officer, methodical, bureaucratic, efficient. He joined the SS in 1934 and rose through the concentration camp system by being competent, loyal, and utterly devoid of empathy. In 1940, he was appointed commandant of Auschwitz, a new camp being built in occupied Poland. He brought his wife, Hedwig Höss, whom he'd married in 1929, and their children, Klaus, born 1930, Heide Traud, 1932, Inga-Brigitt, 1933, Hans-Jürgen, 1937, and Annegret, 1943. The family moved into a villa directly adjacent to Auschwitz IV, literally next door to the camp. From their windows, they could see the prisoners. From their garden, they could hear the screams. Hedwig Höss called it paradise. She really said that. In letters and later statements, she described their time at Auschwitz as idyllic. She had a large house, servants, prisoners, a beautiful garden tended by prisoners, fresh food stolen from prisoners, and her husband came home for dinner every night after a long day at work, murdering people. The children played in that garden. They had birthday parties. They celebrated Christmas. They lived what seemed to them like a normal, comfortable childhood, separated from the camp by a wall, but able to see the smokestacks, smell the burning flesh, hear the sounds of mass murder happening just meters away. Survivors later testified to the surreal horror of tending the Höss family garden while their own families were being gassed, of watching the Höss children play while knowing they themselves would likely be dead within weeks. The Höss children grew up in a house where their father came home from work at Auschwitz and kissed them goodnight, where their mother hosted dinner parties for SS officers, where work meant the systematic extermination of human beings, and nobody in that house saw anything wrong with it. This was their normal. This was their childhood, and it would define everything that came after, the arrest and the trial. The war ended in May 1945, and Rudolf Höss went into hiding. He destroyed his SS uniform, obtained false papers under the name Franz Lang, and found work as a farmhand in Schleswig-Holstein near the Danish border. For 11 months, he lived his force, Franz Lang, believing he might actually escape justice. But British intelligence was hunting him. They tracked down Hedwig and the children, who were living in a village near the former camp. On March 11, 1946, British military police arrested Hedwig and interrogated her about Rudolf's location. She gave him up. Whether she was coerced, whether she believed it would help him, or whether she simply broke under interrogation, we don't know, but she provided information that led to Rudolf's capture. Hours later, British soldiers arrested Rudolf on the farm where he was working. He was beaten during the arrest. British soldiers later admitted they'd lost control when they realized who they'd captured and taken into custody. At his interrogation, Rudolf Höss did something unexpected. He confessed everything, in detail, methodically, like he was filing a report for his superiors. He estimated that 1.1 million people had been murdered at Auschwitz under his command. He explained the gas chamber operations, the crematoria capacity, the efficiency improvements he'd implemented. He showed no remorse, no emotion, just the pride of a bureaucrat explaining a job well done. His testimony became crucial evidence at the Nuremberg trials. Then he was handed over to Polish authorities to face trial in Poland. The trial took place in Warsaw in March 1947. The verdict was never in doubt. On April 2, 1947, Rudolf Höss was sentenced to death. The sentence was to be carried out at Auschwitz itself. Poetic justice demanded he die where he'd murdered over 1 million people. On April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss was hanged on a gallows built next to the villa where his family had lived. The execution was witnessed by Auschwitz survivors. He was 46 years old. The wife, who never apologized, Hedwig Höss, was 38 years old when her husband was executed. She had 5 children, no money, and a surname that meant Auschwitz to everyone who heard it. She also had something else: absolutely no sense of guilt. After Rudolf's execution, Hedwig and the children moved to a small town in northern Germany. She took back her maiden name, Hensel, but the children kept Höss, a decision that would haunt some of them and be embraced by others. Hedwig lived quietly for the next 45 years. She never remarried. She raised her children on Rudolf's pension, yes, his SS pension, which she successfully fought to receive from the West German government. In interviews years later, Hedwig described her time at Auschwitz with nostalgia. She talked about the garden, the house, the comfortable life. When asked about the murders happening next door, she'd say Rudolf never discussed his work at home. When pressed further, she'd insist she hadn't known the full extent of what was happening. This was a lie. Survivors testified that Hedwig frequently visited the camp, that she observed selections, that she knew exactly what her husband did. She lived 300 meters from gas chambers. The smell of burning bodies permeated everything. But Hedwig maintained her innocence until she died on September 15, 1989, at age 80. In all those 42 years after Rudolf's execution, she never once publicly expressed remorse, never apologized to survivors, never acknowledged that her paradise had been built on mass murder. She died comfortable, surrounded by some of her children, having lived a longer and better life than any of the 1.1 million people her husband had murdered. The son who defended him to death, Klaus Höss, the eldest son, was 17 when his father was executed, old enough to remember Auschwitz, old enough to have absorbed his father's worldview, old enough to make a choice about what to believe. Klaus chose to believe his father was a hero. After the war, Klaus became an engineer. He married, had children, lived in Germany, and he spent his entire life insisting that his father had been a good man, that the Holocaust was exaggerated, that Rudolf had simply been following orders and doing his duty. In interviews throughout his life, Klaus defended Auschwitz. He said the gas chambers were for delousing, that the crematoriums were for bodies of people who died of disease, that the Allied estimates of deaths were propaganda, that his father was a scapegoat for crimes that never happened on the scale claimed. None of this was true. His father's own testimony, his own written confession, contradicted every word Klaus said. Rudolf Höss had admitted to everything, had estimated 1.1 million deaths at Auschwitz, had explained in detail how the gas chambers worked. But Klaus didn't care. He'd constructed an alternate reality where his father was innocent, where Auschwitz was something other than what it was, where he could be Rudolf Höss's son without being the son of a mass murderer. Klaus died in September 2015 at age 85, still defending his father, still denying the Holocaust's full scope, still insisting Rudolf had been wronged by history. He left behind children, Rudolf Höss's grandchildren, whose beliefs remain unknown. Klaus, they've never spoken publicly. The daughter who finally spoke, Brigitte Höss, the second child, was born in 1933 and was only 14 when her father was executed. She grew up in post-war Germany, carrying the Höss name, knowing what it meant, and for decades, she said nothing publicly. She married, became Brigitte Höss Breitenbacher, had a family, lived quietly. Unlike Klaus, she didn't defend her father, but unlike what would come later, she didn't confront his crimes either. For 60 years, Brigitte lived in silence. Then, in 2013, something extraordinary happened. Brigitte, now 80 years old, agreed to meet with Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, an Auschwitz survivor who'd been a member of the women's orchestra at the camp. The group of prisoners forced to play music while other prisoners were marched to the gas chambers. The meeting was arranged by Brigitte's son, who'd been researching the family history and believed his mother needed to confront it. At that meeting, Brigitte said something no other Höss family member had ever said publicly. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry for what my father did," she wept. Anita Lasker-Wallfisch embraced her. Brigitte described growing up at Auschwitz as living in a beautiful place, not understanding what was happening beyond the wall. She said learning the full truth as an adult had been devastating, that she'd spent decades not knowing how to process being Rudolf Höss's daughter. The apology didn't erase anything. It didn't bring back a single victim. But it was the first time anyone in the Höss family had publicly acknowledged the weight of Rudolf's crimes and expressed genuine remorse. Brigitte Höss died in 2014, just 1 year after that meeting, at age 81. That public apology was one of her final acts. The youngest children's silence. Hans-Jürgen Höss, born in 1937, was only 10 when his father. He has lived his entire life out of the public eye. No interviews, no statements, no participation in any documentaries or books about the family. What little is known suggests he changed his name, moved frequently, and actively avoided any association with his father's crimes. He's believed to be still alive as of 2024, but his exact location and circumstances are unknown. Inga-Brigitt Höss, the youngest, was born in 1943 during the height of Auschwitz's operations, when the murder rate reached its peak. She was only 4 when her father was executed and has no direct memories of him. Like Hans-Jürgen, Inga-Brigitt has lived in complete silence. She's given no interviews, made no public statements. She's believed to have married and changed her name. Both seem to have made the same choice: total withdrawal from any public reckoning with their father's crimes. Not defense like Klaus, not eventual apology like Brigitte, just silence and disappearance. Whether this is escape or cowardice, survival or moral failure, is a question with no clear answer. The daughter who couldn't escape, Inga-Brigitt Höss, born in 1933, chose yet another path, one that ended in tragedy. 2 tales of her life are fragmentary, but what's known paints a picture of a woman who could never escape her father's shadow. Inga-Brigitt struggled with mental health issues throughout her adult life. She married, but the marriage failed. She had difficulty maintaining employment. She moved frequently. In 2004, at age 71, Inga-Brigitt Höss died. The circumstances of her death have never been made fully public, but some family members have suggested it was suicide. If true, it makes Inga-Brigitt another casualty of Auschwitz. Not murdered there, but destroyed by what happened there. Unable to live with being Rudolf Höss's daughter. Her death raises the same question as Brigitte Frank's suicide. Can inherited guilt literally kill you? Can the weight of your parents' crimes be so crushing that death becomes the only escape? For Inga-Brigitt Höss, the answer may have been yes. The grandson who confronted the past. But here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. Rainer Höss, one of Rudolf's grandsons, Klaus's son, spent the first part of his life believing his grandfather was innocent. His father Klaus had raised him a Holocaust denial on the insistence that Rudolf had been a good man wrongly accused. Then, in his late 30s, Rainer began researching his family history. He read his grandfather's testimony at Nuremberg. He read Rudolf's memoir, written in prison before his execution. He visited Auschwitz, and he realized his father had been lying to him his entire life. The transformation was total. Rainer became a vocal opponent of Holocaust denial and neo-Nazism. He began speaking publicly about his grandfather's crimes, using his position as Rudolf Höss's grandson to combat the very lies his father had spent a lifetime spreading. In 2013, Rainer participated in a documentary where he met with Auschwitz survivors and publicly apologized for his grandfather's crimes. He said, "I cannot undo what he did, but I can make sure people understand what he did, so it never happens again." This put him in direct conflict with his father Klaus, who was still alive and still denying the Holocaust. The family split, with Rainer on one side, his father on the other. Klaus died in 2015, still believing the lies. Rainer continues his work today, speaking at schools and conferences about the Holocaust and the importance of confronting family history, no matter how painful. Rainer Höss represents something rare, a descendant of a Nazi perpetrator who not only acknowledged his ancestors' crimes, but made fighting Holocaust denial his life's mission. He chose the hardest path, confronting his father, destroying the family mythology, and spending his life carrying the weight of crimes committed before he was born. The return to Auschwitz. In 2006, Brigitte Höss, before her meeting with Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, did something she'd avoided for nearly 60 years. She returned to Auschwitz. She walked through the camp. She stood in front of the gas chambers. She visited the villa where she'd lived as a child. A documentary crew followed her. The footage is devastating. Brigitte stood in front of the house where she'd grown up and wept. She said, "I had no idea. We had no idea. We were just children." Then she corrected herself. "No, that's not true. We must have known something. How could we not have known?" That moment of self-correction is perhaps the most honest thing any Höss family member ever said on camera. The admission that the childhood innocence she'd clung to for decades was, at least partly, a lie. That you cannot live 300 meters from gas chambers and truly know nothing. Later, she met with Polish survivors who'd been prisoners when she was a child. Some were hostile. One woman spat at her feet. Others were more forgiving, recognizing that Brigitte had been a child and was now trying, however late, to confront the truth. Brigitte told them, "I am ashamed. Every day of my life, I am ashamed of who my father was and what he did." It didn't bring closure, nothing could, but it was an acknowledgement that the Höss family had benefited from genocide, had lived in comfort while surrounded by death, and that this was something that demanded reckoning. The grandchildren's burden. What about Rudolf Höss's grandchildren and great-grandchildren? There are dozens of them now, scattered across Germany and beyond. Most have remained silent. Many have changed their names. Some may not even know who their great-grandfather was. Their parents may have hidden it, buried it, refused to discuss it. But a few have spoken, usually anonymously. One granddaughter, interviewed by a German newspaper in 2015, described learning at age 16 that she was Rudolf Höss's granddaughter. She said, "I threw up, literally, physically threw up when I read what he'd done. And then I had to go home and face my father, knowing he'd never told me the truth." She said her father, one of the Höss children who'd remained silent, had told her only that her grandfather had worked at a camp and died after the war. Not that he'd commanded Auschwitz, not that he'd overseen the murder of 1.1 million people. She said, "The worst part is knowing that my existence is only possible because of what he did. My grandfather lived in luxury at Auschwitz. My parent was born and raised there. Without the camp, without the murders, I wouldn't exist." How do you process that? That's the question that haunts every descendant of Nazi perpetrators. How do you live when your very existence is built on genocide? Another grandchild, Rainer's sibling, has reportedly cut off all contact with the family and refuses to discuss Rudolf Höss with anyone, including researchers and journalists. Complete severing of connection as the only path to psychological survival. These are the choices Höss's descendants have made. Denial, Klaus. Silence, Hans-Jürgen. Annegret, Inga-Brigitt. Late apology, Brigitte. Active confrontation, Rainer. Total severing, unnamed grandchildren. None of them chose to be related to Rudolf Höss, but all of them have had to choose how to live with that relationship. Part 11, the memorial that will never exist. Rudolf Höss's body was buried in an unmarked grave near Auschwitz. There is no memorial, no headstone, no place for neo-Nazis to gather and pay tribute. The Auschwitz Museum has made sure of that. But in a strange twist of history, Rudolf Höss's villa, the house where his family lived, still stands at Auschwitz. It's been preserved as part of a museum complex. Visitors can walk through the rooms where the Höss children played. They can see the garden where Hedwig hosted parties. They can stand where Rudolf stood when he looked out over the camp he commanded. The villa is now a reminder of how ordinary evil can be, how people can live comfortable domestic lives while committing or enabling genocide, how children can have normal childhoods in houses built on mass murder. Some Höss descendants have objected to the villa's preservation, arguing it glorifies Rudolf. Museum officials have countered that it does the opposite. It shows the banality of evil, the comfortable complicity, the way mass murder was just work for people who then came home and kissed their children. The villa will stand as long as Auschwitz stands, a permanent reminder of the family that lived in paradise while hell existed next door. The legacy that never ends. Rudolf Höss was executed on April 16, 1947, 77 years ago, but his legacy is still destroying lives. His daughter Inga-Brigitt may have killed herself, unable to bear being his child. His wife lived 42 years in comfort, without ever apologizing for the years she spent living in luxury while people were murdered next door. His son Klaus spent 68 years defending the indefensible, dying in 2015, still believing Auschwitz was a lie. His daughter Brigitte spent 60 years in silence before finally, at age 80, saying "I'm sorry" to a survivor. His grandchildren carry DNA linked to the man who perfected the industrial murder process at Auschwitz. Some have changed their names, some have disappeared completely. One, Rainer, has spent years fighting the lies his father taught him, and his great-grandchildren are growing up now, some perhaps not even knowing they're descended from Rudolf Höss, others knowing and carrying that weight every day of their lives. The Höss family's story forces us to confront impossible questions. Are you responsible for your grandfather's crimes? Your great-grandfather's crimes? If you were born in a house built on genocide, raised on money stolen from murdered people, do you owe something to their descendants? Can you ever escape your family's crimes? Or are they permanent, carried in your DNA, visible in your surname, inescapable, no matter how far you run? The Höss children each gave their own answer. Klaus chose denial until death. Brigitte chose late acknowledgement. Inga-Brigitt may have chosen death itself. The others chose silence and disappearance. And Rainer, the grandson, chose the hardest path, confronting the lies, acknowledging the truth, and spending his life trying to prevent it from happening again. Rudolf Höss's last words were about history's judgment. He was right. History has judged him. But history is still judging his family. His children are mostly dead now. His grandchildren are aging. His great-grandchildren are living their lives, some knowing their family history, others blissfully unaware. But the legacy never dies. It just gets passed down, generation after generation, an inheritance nobody asked for and nobody can fully escape. The villa at Auschwitz still stands. Rudolf Höss's testimony is still used to teach about the Holocaust. His grandchildren still carry his name or the names they adopted to escape it. And somewhere, right now, a young person is Googling their family history and discovering they're descended from the commandant of Auschwitz. They'll have to choose, just like the Höss children chose, just like the grandchildren chose: denial, silence, confrontation, escape. There are no good options when your ancestor murdered 1.1 million people. There are only different ways of carrying a weight that can never be put down.